The wind howled fiercely through the dry, cracked land of the west. A solitary figure, draped in tattered clothes, stumbled through the scorching sun. Her boots kicked up clouds of dust as she trudged along the lonely road, her heart heavy with the weight of unspoken grief. Amelia Dawson had never known a life without hardship. Her father had passed when she was just a girl, and her mother's health had slowly withered away in the harsh wilderness of the Wyoming frontier. But it wasn't the loss of family that brought her to this point. It was the bitter sting of betrayal. Her husband, the man she thought would be her strength, had gambled away their farm in a desperate bid for wealth. He disappeared one cold morning, leaving only a broken promise and an empty pocketbook behind. Amelia had tried to keep their land, but with the crops failing and debts mounting, the inevitable came. Now all she had was the clothes on her back, a few coins in her pocket, and the daunting stretch of the unknown before her. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Amelia reached the outskirts of a small town, its silhouette rising against the fading light. She had no destination in mind, no plan, just a vague hope that she might find work or shelter, somewhere, anywhere. But the town seemed too quiet, too still. As she walked down the dusty main street, a loud crack of a door opening startled her. A tall figure stepped into view, blocking the sun. "You're a long way from home, miss," a deep voice said, gravelly with a trace of concern, but edged with something else she couldn't quite place. Amelia froze, her eyes scanning the man who stood before her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a weathered cowboy hat, a rough brown duster, and sturdy boots. His face was rugged, a deep scar running across his cheek, his eyes dark and unreadable. She didn't speak at first, unsure whether to trust the stranger. She had learned the hard way that trust in these parts was a dangerous thing. "Do you need help?" he asked, his gaze softening slightly. Amelia didn't know what to say. She had never been the type to ask for help, never had the luxury. But as the wind picked up again, she felt the cold bite of exhaustion and the overwhelming weight of her own pride. "I'm just passing through," she replied, her voice almost lost in the wind. The man studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You don't look like you're passing through. You look like you're running from something." His eyes flicked down to the worn fabric of her dress, the dirt and blood staining it. Amelia clenched her jaw. She wasn't going to share her story with him. Not now. Not ever. "You should come inside," the man said after a moment. "Get some rest. There's no point in standing out here all night." Amelia hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to keep walking. But her feet, tired and worn, betrayed her, and she found herself following him into the building. The door closed behind them with a heavy thud. Inside, the space smelt of wood and something faintly sweet, a stark contrast to the dust and heat outside. The man led her to a chair by the fire, his movements purposeful but not unkind. "I'm Luke," he said quietly as he poured a cup of water. "You don't have to tell me your name if you don't want to, but I'm guessing you're not just passing through." Amelia sat, her eyes drifting to the fire. She was too tired to argue, too broken to fight her instincts any longer. She was safe, for now, but deep in her chest something stirred. Was she truly safe? Or was this another trap? The stranger in front of her, with his haunted eyes and weathered soul, seemed to have his own secrets. And as the fire crackled in the silence between them, Amelia couldn't help but wonder, was this the beginning of something new, or would the shadows of her past forever loom over her, no matter where she went? The warmth from the fire spread through Amelia's bones as she sat in silence, her fingers clutching the rough fabric of her dress. Luke had stepped away from the fire, his back turned as he moved around the small cabin. She watched him warily, noting the way his movements were both graceful and tense, like a man who had seen far more than his share of hardship. He returned with a blanket and laid it across her shoulders, his eyes lingering on her for a moment too long. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, sitting down across from her. The crackling fire between them only added to the tension in the room. Amelia shifted uneasily. "No," she answered curtly. "I'm from a small farm in the valley. Or I was." Luke nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I can see it in your eyes. You've had to fight for everything you've got." Amelia's heart skipped a beat. How could he know? Had he already seen through her hardened exterior, or was it just a feeling he got from the way she carried herself? Most people who come through here, they're looking for something. Work, safety, maybe even hope. But not you, Luke continued, his voice low but steady. You're running from something or someone. Amelia's pulse quickened. She had never been good at hiding the truth from people, even when she tried. She clenched her jaw and stared at the fire, unwilling to let him see the depth of her pain. She had learned early that revealing too much was a weakness. But Luke didn't press her. Instead, he stood up and walked over to the small stove at the side of the room, grabbing a pot and setting it over the fire. "You look like you could use a meal," he said, his tone softer now. "It's the least I can do." She didn't respond immediately. It had been days since she had eaten more than scraps. The rumbling in her stomach betrayed her, but still, she hesitated. He wasn't asking for anything in return, at least not yet. And that was the problem. People who were too kind always had a hidden agenda. She knew that all too well. But as the smell of stew began to fill the room, Amelia realized just how exhausted she truly was. Her body ached, and the weight of her circumstances pressed down on her like 1,000 stones. "You don't have to cook for me," she said softly, her voice betraying her weariness. "I'm fine." Luke shot her a knowing look over his shoulder. "You're not fine. But I'm guessing that's not something you want to admit." Amelia remained silent. She didn't want to talk about it. Not now. She couldn't let her guard down, not even for a man who had been nothing but kind to her so far. Still, something about his presence was different. He wasn't like the others she had encountered along her journey. Those who only saw her as a means to an end, or a quick solution to their own problems. Luke seemed different. As the stew simmered, they sat in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Amelia watched him closely, trying to gauge his every movement, but he gave little away. His face was unreadable, though there was a weariness in his eyes, a shadow that hinted at a life far more complicated than it appeared. When the food was finally ready, Luke ladled a bowl for Amelia, and then sat across from her, his own bowl in hand. "I didn't ask you earlier," he said, as he took a bite, "but what brings you to this part of the world?" Amelia froze. The question was innocent enough, but it felt like a crack in the wall she had built around herself. She didn't want to share her past with him, but the moment he asked, a surge of anger flared within her chest. Her husband's face flashed before her eyes, the way he had smiled when he promised her they would make it through, the way he had held her hand as they watched the sunset together on their wedding night. She had believed in him, trusted him. She had given him everything, and he had taken it all, leaving her with nothing. "I came here to survive," Amelia said through gritted teeth, forcing herself to calm down. "I'm just trying to survive." Luke studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "That's all anyone can do out here, I guess." He didn't push her further. Instead, he reached for his own bowl, his fingers brushing against hers in a brief but charged moment. Amelia's heart skipped a beat. She pulled her hand away quickly, not trusting herself to feel anything in this place, with this man. There was something about him, something that made her feel vulnerable, and she didn't like it. "Why do you live out here, Luke?" she asked suddenly, needing to shift the focus away from herself. "Why stay in this small town in the middle of nowhere?" Luke's expression darkened. He set his bowl down, his hands clenched tightly around the edge of the table. "It's not the town," he said slowly, his voice rough with emotion. "It's the people who come through here. Sometimes they need a place to hide, and sometimes they just need to forget. Me, I don't mind being forgotten." Amelia's curiosity was piqued, but she knew better than to press him further. Whatever it was that haunted him, he wasn't ready to share it. As the night wore on, the fire burned lower, and the two of them sat in silence. Amelia, lost in her own thoughts, couldn't shake the feeling that Luke was hiding something, just as she was. But for now, there was no need to confront it. Not yet. The morning sun crept over the horizon, casting a soft light into the small cabin. Amelia woke to the sound of birds chirping and the scent of fresh coffee brewing. The fire had long since died, but the warmth of the cabin still lingered, as did the strange feeling that had settled in her chest overnight. Luke was already up, moving quietly around the room. She had heard him stirring before dawn, but she had stayed in bed, unwilling to leave the comfort of the warm blankets. The past few days had been a blur of dust, hunger, and the weight of endless decisions. The man sitting before her now, drinking his coffee as if the world had not been an unforgiving place, seemed like a stranger from a different time. "You sleep okay?" Luke asked, his voice surprisingly soft as he noticed her stir. Amelia rubbed her eyes, trying to push away the lingering exhaustion. She had slept deeper than she had in a long time, the kind of sleep that comes when you're too tired to think, too tired to care. "I slept fine," she replied, sitting up slowly. "Thank you for letting me stay." Luke nodded, a hint of something unreadable in his eyes. "It's not much, but it's home." She watched him for a moment, taking in the way the light caught the edges of his weathered face, the hard lines of his jaw, the faint scar that ran across his cheek. He was a man who carried the weight of years, a man who had seen things, done things, that made him a stranger to the world. Yet, there was a kindness in him, a quiet strength that drew her in, despite her best efforts to resist. "I'm not sure what I'm doing here, Luke," Amelia said, breaking the silence between them. Her words were more raw than she intended, the weight of them settling heavily in her chest. He didn't look at her right away, but his fingers tightened around his coffee cup. "None of us do. Not really. We just keep moving." "I don't know if I can keep moving," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've lost everything, and I don't know how to pick up the pieces." Luke's gaze shifted to her then, and for the first time since they'd met, his eyes softened. "Sometimes, you don't pick up the pieces, you just keep walking." Amelia swallowed hard. His words echoed in her mind, reverberating through her like a distant memory. She had told herself that same thing countless times. She had convinced herself that survival was all that mattered, until she was no longer sure what she was surviving for. As the silence stretched between them, Amelia's thoughts drifted back to her past. Her husband, the promises he had made, the lies he had told. He had been her whole world once, the man she had trusted with everything, and he had shattered it all, leaving her alone in the harshest place she had ever known. She glanced up at Luke, unsure of what to say next. His expression was unreadable, but there was a quiet strength about him that made her want to believe in something again, something other than survival. I think I might stay here for a while," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "Just until I figure things out." Luke nodded, his face softening ever so slightly. "It's your choice." But Amelia wasn't sure if it was a choice anymore. After everything that had happened, she didn't know where she belonged anymore. This town, this man, they were both part of a strange, uncharted future she had never imagined. Later that day, after a simple meal of stew and bread, Luke took her out into the town. He didn't say much as they walked through the small streets, but Amelia could feel the tension in the air. It was a quiet, watchful town, the kind that had seen its share of travelers, each with their own stories, their own reasons for passing through. As they approached a small general store, Amelia's eyes caught sight of a familiar face, one she had hoped never to see again. A man stood near the counter, his back to them, his dark hat pulled low over his face. But Amelia knew him instantly. It was Thomas, her husband, the man who had left her behind. Her breath caught in her throat. It couldn't be. It couldn't possibly be him. But as he turned slightly, their eyes met, and her heart dropped into her stomach. Thomas froze. His face went pale as he recognized her. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them seemed to freeze, heavy with the weight of their shared past. And then, without a word, he turned and rushed toward the door, knocking over a crate of apples in his haste. Amelia's legs felt like jelly, her body refusing to obey her as she watched him flee. She wanted to run after him, to confront him, but she couldn't make herself move. Her mind was a blur of anger and confusion, her heart aching with the familiar pain of betrayal. "Amelia? Wait." Luke's voice broke through the fog in her mind as he grabbed her arm, pulling her back from the door. But Amelia was already shaking her head, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She couldn't look at him, couldn't even find the words to explain the chaos that was unfolding inside her. "Let him go," Luke said quietly, his grip firm but gentle. "He doesn't deserve your anger." Her chest tightened, and she turned away from him, retreating back into the safety of the cabin. But her mind was ready to confront Thomas, and she wasn't sure if she would ever be ready to confront the feelings he had left behind. But for the first time in a long while, Amelia realized that she wasn't alone anymore. Luke had seen her at her weakest, and yet he had offered nothing but kindness. Maybe it was time to stop running. But that was a decision for tomorrow. Amelia sat in the quiet of the cabin, her mind reeling with thoughts of Thomas, of the past that she had worked so hard to bury. The cabin felt smaller now, more confined, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. The anger she had buried for so long surged to the surface, sharp and unforgiving. But beneath it, there was also something else, something that made her stomach churn with uncertainty. She could still feel the imprint of Thomas's gaze, the way his eyes had widened in fear the moment he saw her. It was a look she hadn't expected from him. The man who had left her without a word, without a care, now seemed as lost as she had felt that day. The truth was, she didn't know what to feel. The betrayal, the confusion, and the hurt twisted inside her, leaving her unsure of where to go next. The door opened quietly, and Luke stepped inside, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He didn't say anything at first, just let the silence hang between them as he took a seat across from her. The fire crackled softly in the corner, but the room still felt cold, distant. "I thought I'd find you here," Luke said softly, his voice gentle, as if he understood the storm raging within her. Amelia didn't respond immediately. She couldn't. There were too many things she wanted to say, too many emotions clawing at her heart. But they wouldn't form into words. She just stared into the fire, her thoughts swirling like the flames. Luke's presence was a steady comfort, something she hadn't realized she needed until now. He didn't push her to speak, didn't demand explanations. He simply sat with her, his quiet strength a balm to her fractured soul. "I saw him," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "I saw Thomas." Luke's eyes softened. "I figured. How do you feel about it?" The question hung in the air, simple and raw. Amelia took a shaky breath, trying to gather her thoughts. She wanted to say she was angry, that she hated him for what he had done to her. But the truth was there was still a part of her that loved him, even after everything. "I don't know," she confessed, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to feel anymore. I thought I'd be able to let it go, to move on. But seeing him, it was like nothing had changed, like I'm still that woman who believed in him. And I don't know if I can be that woman anymore." Luke didn't answer right away. His eyes never left her, as if he was searching for something in her that she couldn't see. "Have to be the woman you were," he said quietly. "You can be whoever you need to be. You've got the strength to change, to move forward, no matter what's happened." Amelia's chest tightened at his words. There was so much truth in them, so much honesty. She hadn't felt like she could move forward for so long, not after everything that had happened. But Luke was showing her a different way, a way out of the darkness that had consumed her for so long. "You're right," she whispered. "I've been holding on to the past, and I've let it control me for too long." Luke stood up, crossing the room to where she sat. For a moment, Amelia thought he was going to say something more, but instead he simply extended his hand to her. His touch was warm, steady, offering something she hadn't known she needed, a promise of safety, of a future she could still shape. "Come with me," he said quietly, There's nothing left for you here, except for what's been haunting you. You don't have to face it alone." For the first time since she'd arrived, Amelia felt the weight lift from her chest, just a little. She looked up at Luke, at the kindness in his eyes, and realized that maybe, just maybe, she could begin again. Maybe the scars of the past didn't have to define her. Amelia stood slowly, her hand still in his. She wasn't sure where Luke's offer would lead, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel so lost. Together they stepped outside. The air was crisp, the sun setting behind the distant hills, casting a soft glow over the land. It was a new beginning, and while the road ahead was uncertain, Amelia felt a spark of hope ignite in her heart. She wasn't running anymore, not from the past, and not from the future. As they walked side by side, the weight of her past began to lift, piece by piece. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew that she didn't have to face it alone. The journey ahead was theirs to walk together, and with that thought, the horizon ahead seemed a little less daunting.